another common way to use sliders is to adjust the size of something. In our case, let's make it so that we can adjust the font size. And it just makes sense when you think about it. So if you're looking at a watch and some text, for example, is really small, it would be nice to have a slider to just increase that text wherever you need to. So let's figure out how we can do that. First of all, I'm going to reconfigure some of my code here. So I'm going to get rid of this label down here. So I'm going to get rid of it. And over here, that means I'm going to get rid of the lower label. Okay, I'm also going to get rid of this label here. So get rid of that. Get rid of that label there. That means you don't need to set the text here. And it's going to break basically everything here. So I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, so we still have our outlet slider. Right, so we still have the IB outlet, and we also have the IB action for the slider. And it's just kind of mad at us because we have a constant that we're not using here. We'll come back to that. But for now, let's kind of reconfigure what our code here looks like, or our UI, I mean. So first of all, I'm going to get rid of the group. I'm just going to erase the group, and I'm going to put in a new label. Okay, so I'm going to go to my main editor here, and let's zoom back in. Too far. There we go. Okay, so let's get a label in here. There we go. I'm going to push this slider to the very bottom. So that means vertical will be bottom. This I'll put in the center, and vertical center as well. Okay, so this text is the text we are going to want to increase the size of. So let's do that. So let's open up our assistant editor and get rid of this, maximize our space here, and move this over. Okay, there we go. All right, so our slider is already attached to our code. Let's attach our label here again to our code. Outlet my, let my label. Okay, and let's say we want to be able to increase it, I don't know, up to 5 times. All right, so instead of 16 steps, we'll put 5. That means we need to update it in the attribute inspector as well. Right, so we're going to set the default value to, say, 3, somewhere in the middle. Minimum will be 0. Maximum will be 5. And let's make it so that it has 5 steps as well. Okay. So now we can start at 3, we can go all the way up to 5, so we can increase it twice, we can decrease it basically as much as we need to as well. So let's go in and let's take a look at our label. So our label, let's adjust the text, the font rather. So put it to a system font so that we can adjust the size. And let's say at size 3, let's make it, let's see, size 12 for the font. You know what? No, let's make it 14 for the font. Okay, that's kind of a nice mid-range. It's kind of small. It might be too small for some, but maybe not for others. And we give the option to adjust it as needed. Okay, so in order to change the font size, we need to use an attributed string. So that does make it a little bit more complicated than you might expect, but it's not going to be too bad here. So I'm going to make a separate function to actually do the resizing. And then for each of our case statements in our switch, we're just going to call that function. So this function I will call label resizer. And it's going to take in font size parameter. And for this, I'm going to use a CG float, which, as you can see, basic type of floating point scalar values in core graphics and related frameworks, obviously. And the reason I'm using this is because that's what our attributed string is going to need in terms of us declaring the font size. So you'll see what I mean by this in 1 minute, but basically I'm going to say let font size, let's see here. You know what, let's change this to let size because we're declaring font size as our parameter. So just to keep it clear on our own minds. Let font size, and for this we will say ns font attribute name. As you can see, it's kind of auto-completed some of it there. NS font attribute name. UI font is what we want to change. UI font dot system font. because we have it set to a system font. And then as you can see, it takes a CG float for of size. That's why I'm using CG float in my declaration here in my parameters. So CG float, we're just going to give it the font size that's passed in when we request the function. So font size is what that should read. There we go. Okay, so this is our attribute we're going to pass into our attributed string. And attributed strings, you just kind of have to get used to the syntax. So let's see here. What's this angry about? I didn't put my opening and closing curly braces. Make sure I put one here as well. Don't want to forget those, that's for sure. Okay. So as for actually figuring out the string, let's space that in here. So we want to basically grab that outlet my label.set attributed text. So set attributed text, and by the way, if you're not sure what an attributed string is, it's basically a string with some details passed along with it. In our case, we're passing along a font size variable. So the attributed text, this will say ns attributed string. That's what we're passing in. And our attributed string, we're going to give it a string here. Let's just make the string label for now. Okay, in attributes, here we pass in our size attribute, where we declared it in the format it requires, right? NS font attribute name. A little bit complex, but this should achieve what we want it to achieve. Now we need to be able to call this function depending on which case is selected. So let's go ahead and make another switch statement. Switch label value. Okay. So for case 0, remember we're converting our value here into an integer. So that's why I can say case 0. Well, we can say label resizer. Label resizer. Font size, well, let's say this one will be 8.0. Okay, pretty small there. Next, let's do case 1. Label resizer, font size 10.0, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to do that for the rest of these. Label resizer 12.0, just going up by 2 each time. Case 3, label resizer. And this one is in the middle, right? So I believe we set 14 for this size initially anyway. Let me double check that though. So on our label, if I pop out my attributes inspector, yeah, so it defaults to size 14, which will be our case 3, right? So that's why it's going to reset back to that size if we go back to that size. Case 4, label resizer, font size 16. Case 5, label resizer, font size 18.0. Okay, and anytime you use a switch statement, you do need a default. So default, we will just label resizer, font size 14.0, just in case. Okay, now let's try it out. Let's see if it's working. So we'll run our simulator. And as usual, I will remind you this is just one way of doing this, not necessarily the best way. Everyone will have a different way. But this should give us what we want to achieve, right? This should allow us to resize our text label. So wait for it to load up. There it is. Okay, fingers crossed. We're going to shrink it. There it goes. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now it's really tiny. Let's make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And there we go. So a simple, or maybe not so simple way to resize our label. And we just have to make sure that we know how to use attributed strings in order to do that. We have a resizing functionality, but our code is not really modular. We're not really taking advantage of the full potential of our slider here. So let's think about how we can improve this. So right now we're just basically hard coding in a font size, and you can see that it's basically a float. It's technically a CG float, but it has the same appearance as a float. So we might be able to, instead of just using this case statement, which is actually kind of inefficient, right? We're going to have the system kind of go through all these cases, determine which one is the right one, and then call the function every time. Well, what if there was a way that we could just tell our slider to start at something like 8.0 and to finish at the highest at 18.0? Well, of course, that is pretty simple to do. So first of all, I'm going to get rid of some of this code. And by some, I mean all, basically. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a look here at our slider. So we still want it to have 5 steps. We want to be able to increase or decrease the size 5 times. And how are we going to do that? Well, if I go into my editor here and open up my attributes inspector, well, all we need to do is basically give those values here instead. So these are the floats, and these are what we're looking for in our case statements before we convert them into integer, or after we convert them into integers. Right? So actually, let me bring this back just so I can see the numbers. There we go. So we can see we want to start at the lowest at 8.0 and the highest at 18.0. That means if we select our slider value, we want to start in the middle, right? So previously we assigned this to case 3. So I'm just going to put 14 in that one. Minimum, well, the minimum we want to allow is 8, right? That's the smallest font size we want to go to. Maximum is going to be 18, right? And we still want to have 5 steps. Okay, so far, so good. Let's get rid of that. So now let's see what happens. So we're going to get rid of these case statements. Let's see here. Get rid of that. And now we can just say, get rid of this too, label resizer, and it's going to take in a CG float, and you would think we would just be able to say value, but float and CG float are not technically the same thing. So we're going to have to convert it to a CG float. And as you can see, it's popped up this little fix it. It says replace value with CG float value. So instead of converting it into an integer, we're converting it into a CG float. This way our code makes a lot more sense, logically speaking. We don't technically need the case statement if we know how to use our slider here. So let's see what this does, right? So basically every time this is clicked, it's going to run the function, and it's doing the same thing we were doing previously, but instead of hard coding in the floats, or the CG floats rather, we just tell it to, hey, look what we're putting in, and then run that function based on that number, right? So we don't always need to start at 0, and we don't need to always go up to 5. We just basically tell it the numbers we're looking for. And this is a lot more efficient use of our code. So let's wait for it to load up. Let's make sure it works, and then we can kind of refactor this even more. Okay, so we have our label. If I increase it, you can see it still goes 5 steps. And it's working exactly the same as before without having to have all those lines of code to do the same thing we're doing now. We can actually make it even better though. So if we say, let's see here. So right now we're just hard coding this specific label, but if we had multiple sliders that were affecting multiple labels, well, we would have to make a new function for each of those. So let's fix that. And what I can do is I can take one parameter font size. I can take another parameter label will be WK interface label interface. Actually, no, let's just put in a string. So say label will be a string. Okay, and then we will just basically redefine this outlet my label. So we'll create a variable up here instead. So you know what, we can make it a constant because we're not changing it. Let my label equal label, right? We could of course change that to another string if we wanted to. But basically, we can basically pass that label along so that our code, our function here is a lot more modular. So if we pass in font size, CG float, label, my label, there it is. And now we can pass that in here. Instead of string label, we can say label. before I move on, we can also kind of input the label itself as a parameter, as an argument in the function. So let me reconfigure this. So instead of my label, let's just say let my text equal label. And then down here, instead of label, we will say my text, and it'll take text instead of label. Okay, and then string will be text. All right, and let's pass in the actual label itself. That way we can reuse this function if we ever need to a lot more easily. So let's see. So we have this outlet my label. So let's just pass that in as a parameter here. So say font size, text, and label will be WatchKit interface label. Okay, and here it's just going to set it to the label. Alrighty, and then we just pass it in here like so. Label, outlet, my label. There we go. A lot more functional now. Let's test it out to make sure that it's working as intended, as usual. And hey, we may have added a couple more lines, but overall we reduced our overall code. And I like to say, whenever you can get rid of code, it's a good thing. It's part of the process of refactoring. So there it goes. Should be ready here. Okay, and now we can use this. Now, if we ever wanted to, for example, put in another label with a different slider, we could just basically call the function. Right? It's a lot more reusable. It's never that good of an idea to hard code values in like we were doing before. Let's refactor this a little bit so that we don't need to actually declare everything all at once. So put an underscore in front, and then we should be able to get rid of the declarations here. Okay, and there we go. And I think we're going to need a space as well. Oops. Space, space, space. And we'll just give it a second here. Yeah, now we don't have to declare font size as this. We can just kind of use those. We can use those if we want to, but they're basically made optional now. So now if we run this, again, it'll work. And in the meantime, just to show how this is useful, let's add in another label, maybe, and another slider. But I think you get the idea. Okay, that's going to load up here. Cool. Still works as intended. All right, so let's go ahead, and now that we have most of our code figured out, we can easily add in more labels and more sliders. So let's do that, because why not? Okay, so we'll come in. We will grab a, let's see here. We'll grab a label, put it up at the very top, and we'll center it. Let's see, horizontal center. Yep, and we'll put a slider as well. Okay. And this label will say, hi there. Let's change the font size as well to something different. So let's see, font, we'll make it a system font so that we can change it. System font, and let's make this one pretty small. So 8 will be the midpoint for this one. Okay, and then this one, let's see here. Let's see, steps, we'll do 5 steps as well. We will do, so let's start it at value, well, let's see. So minimum we want to go down. Let's say we want to go down to, I don't know, 4. Maximum will go up to 12, and we'll make it 5 steps. And value, let's see here. Let's set it at, sure, 8. We'll start it kind of midway through as well. Okay, and these are going to be our CG floats later on. Let's connect this to our back end, to our code. So we'll put this as an outlet. Control click, bring it here. Outlet my upper label, for example. All right, and we'll kind of code in the text as well. So let my upper text equals hi there. All right, and now we just need to set a function for this lower resizer, basically. So this will be an action my upper slider. Okay, it takes in a value, and we will just call label resizer. Font size will be value. All right, text will be what is our text here? It's called my upper text. My upper text. And label will be whatever that outlet label is called, which is outlet my upper label. Outlet my upper label. Okay, so that should be all we need to do. Yes, we need to do a CG float. CG float value. Okay, so that should be all we need to do to be able to make use of our resizer function. So once we have our initial code figured out, you can see it's going to be a lot easier to reuse. Okay, we'll make sure it works. Let it load up there. Okay, there it goes. And now we can definitely resize it as needed. We can make it really tiny. So if this was on a watch face, this would be basically impossible to read unless you have super good vision. But otherwise, we can see that it's pretty nice to be able to just reuse that code. It has a little weirdness in terms of it allows us to go higher than we intended, right? So we just need to kind of adjust those steps. But other than that, it's working as intended.